One of the most egregious myths is that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. The statement is so absurd that many Crimeans, when asked why they wanted to join Russia and separate from Ukraine in 2014, said that they felt Russians, not Ukrainians. So if it's one people, why do you segregate yourself from Ukraine? The whole separatist movement in eastern Ukraine was based on the idea that their home was Russia, not Ukraine. The entire justification for separatism basically depended on the exact opposite idea that Ukrainians and Russians are not the same people. Or for example, in the Soviet Empire, for instance, the Soviet Union, in 1954, the tricentennial of the union between Russia and Ukraine was celebrated. 300 years of union by 1954. So how in the world could it be one people if there was a point before where they allied? In this video, I will explain briefly but clearly why Ukraine is not Russia in the way propaganda tries to sell it. My name is Igor. My passport says I was born in Russia during the Soviet Union, but I am ethnically Ukrainian. I grew up between Russia and Ukraine. Today I live in Spain and I serve as a missionary of the gospel sent for ministry by Sherwood Baptist Church in Newcastle, Oklahoma. If you live in the southwest Oklahoma City area and you are looking for a Baptist church with sound doctrine, Bible preaching, and Christ-centered fellowship, not entertainment, please visit Sherwood Baptist Church on Highway 37 in Newcastle, Oklahoma. Now, history. Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus all traced roots to the medieval state called Rus. Sometimes textbooks call it Kievan Rus, but this term is a late innovation. The people there did not call it Kievan Rus, they called it simply Rus, where Kiev was the main political and cultural center for much of that period. Kiev was a key city on a trade route from the Baltic Sea to Byzantium, what they call from the Varangians to the Greeks. So yes, Kiev is ancient, Kiev is older than Moscow, and Kiev is important. But here is the thing, Rus was not Russia, it was Rus, and the modern Russian state did not yet exist. It later developed primarily from northeastern principalities such as Vladimir Suzdal and later the Duchy of Moscow, which gradually expanded and increasingly presented itself as the main heir of the old Rus legacy, and much later evolved into Russia as we know it today. That principality in the east, Vladimir Suzdal, grew throughout centuries in what we know as Russia. So let's go back to Kiev from the 9th century through the early 12th century. The 11th century was the zenith of its splendor under the rule of Yaroslav the Wise, but later the political center shifted. Byzantium weakened, trade routes changed, and Rus fragmented into different principalities. Two branches deserve special attention: Galicia-Volhynia versus already mentioned Vladimir Suzdal. In the southwestern, you had the Principality of Galicia-Volhynia. This is very important. It is part of modern Ukrainian historical development. Its king, Danilo Romanovich, Daniel of Galicia, was crowned as king of Ruthenia in 1253 by a papal envoy. This is not mythology, this is just documented European history. At the same time, in the northeast, you had the Principality of Vladimir Suzdal, as said. From it emerged the Duchy of Moscow. That is where the future Russian state developed. So after Kiev's decline, you don't have one state. You have different states, different political cultures, different centers, different elites. To say Ukrainians and Russians are one people is like saying Rome existed, therefore Spain and France are the same country. Then you also have the Novgorod Republic in the north, a different system. It was conquered by Moscow in 1478. Naturally, Moscow did not conquer it peacefully, everything done in the best medieval traditions. This is how Moscow actually grew: conquest, annexation, absorption. Back to Ukraine. Here is the crucial difference between the two branches. The northeastern branch, Moscow, developed toward strict centralized authority, toward absolutism, monarchical absolutism, toward one ruler, one state. Eventually this became the Tsardom of Russia. The southwestern branch, Galicia-Volhynia, and later Ukrainian lands were influenced by European legal traditions like Magdeburg law, giving autonomy to cities. It developed more horizontal social structures. Nobility and had more power, cities had more rights, the prince was checked more. So even before modern democracy, you already see different DNA. In today's Russia, one man runs the country for about a quarter of a century, while in Ukraine, during the same time, presidents have changed in every election, with the exception of Leonid Kuchma, who served 2 terms, winning both elections fairly and democratically. Now, over time, Galicia-Volhynia, the southwest branch, couldn't stand against a giant, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It became part of it, but in 1648, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, a Ukrainian nobleman, led a war of liberation. The result was the Cossack Hetmanate, which was a fully functioning state. It had an army, it had diplomacy, it signed treaties, but again, Ukraine was stuck between giant predators: Poland, Moscow, and the Ottoman Empire. You had to make a choice with whom to ally. And Khmelnytsky made a pact with Moscow, which by that time was no longer some small Vladimir Suzdal principality, but already a regional power with imperial ambitions. From there began Moscow's yoke over Ukraine that led to existential erasures and forced depopulation, from the catastrophe of Baturin in 1608 to the engineered famine of the 1930s. These weren't just isolated historical accidents, they were deliberate attempts to rebore the engine of a nation to fit an imperial chassis. So it was a big state, a power that became an empire, suppressing a weaker player, a weaker neighbor. But back to the Roman Empire analogy. To say Kiev was the first capital of Russia is like saying today Rome was the first capital of Spain, because Spain once was fully part of the Roman Empire. Sounds impressive, but so what? Should Spain invade Italy to claim the capital? Kiev was a center of Rus, not Moscow's property. Today's war is heavily ideologically packed, and this is not a misunderstanding between brothers poked by the Anglo-Saxons. It is a history of an empire trying to swallow a nation it failed to swallow before. It's not about NATO, not primarily. Russia has NATO on its borders in Norway and Finland, and now Sweden is also in NATO. All 3 Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, are NATO members. Why didn't they start a war in the Baltic Sea? It's not about NATO. The United States was built on the fundamental idea that the people should decide their own destiny. What if it is simply the Ukrainians' choice to be part of the West? What if their attempt to join a military alliance is a defensive reflex against centuries of Russian pressure? We must ask, what prevails? NATO that is aggressively expanding, or is the sovereign European nations driven by a deep-seated fear born of their own history with Russia, who are knocking on NATO's door for a seat at the table? And it's not that easy to be accepted into that club. So it's not NATO, it's not about biolabs, even if scientific facilities exist. Does that entitle a neighbor to invade, destroy homes, target civilians, shell churches, and burn books? It is about imperial identity. Without Ukraine, Russia is just Russia. Large, strong, but not holy, not chosen, not destined to rule. If you want more on this mindset, check my other video about the Russian imperial soul. My name is Igor. I am a missionary in Spain sent by Sherwood Baptist Church in Newcastle, Oklahoma. If you are in that area, visit Sherwood Baptist Church, sound doctrine, biblical preaching, and true Christian fellowship. Thanks for watching.